Hello everyone and welcome to season 6 of our A-level religious studies webinars delivered by the Theology and Religious Studies team here at the University of Chester. My name is Isabel from the Outreach team and I'm delighted to be introducing this event today. Our TRS team started these webinars way back in 2020 to support schools during the pandemic, offering free talks on aspects of the A-level religious studies curriculum. The enrichment these talks bring to current students and the popularity of the topics has led us to our 6th season this year. The webinars represent some of the special features of TRS here at Chester, their drive to use their expertise to support communities outside of the university and to make a difference, their passion for their subject, their commitment to supporting RE in schools and to making learning both relevant and fun. If you want to find out more about what we have on offer in the way of courses, please do visit our website and I will put the link for that in the chat shortly. If you're a current A-level student, I would be really grateful if you could complete our pre-event evaluation form, which will then follow with a short post-event form later. But let me introduce our first speaker in this series for today, Professor Hannah Bacon, who is Professor of Feminist Theology, works on Christian thought, especially how it intersects with the lives of women. Hannah will explore with us some issues around Christian God talk and gender, addressing what's at stake when thinking about the language used for God, and think about what theological grounds there might be for imagining God or imaging God as mother. Drawing specifically on the work of Sallie McFague, we'll look at her concerns around male-centered God language and the model of God as mother. So Hannah, we thank you that you're going to tackle this for us today. We'll hear from you shortly for around 20 minutes or so, and hopefully some of you will have some questions for us at the end. Just to reassure everyone, we can't hear or see you, and so no one else can as well. If you wish to ask us a question or engage, you can use the Q&A or chat functions. If you ask questions, they will be anonymous and I will moderate them, so just be aware of that. And then at the end, we'll field them over to Hannah to see what we can help you with. So Hannah, I'm going to leave you to it now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Leah. Leah, can I just check that you can see the screen okay?
Yeah, that's fine. We can see everything. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So, hi everybody. Thanks for joining us again for this new season of webinars. It's great to have you on the call. So today we're going to be looking at this question, can we call God mother? And if you're contemplating that question, you might think, well, it's pretty obvious. Of course we can call God mother because our language is just a human construct. It's to do with drawing things from our own human experience and using those human classifications and categories to speak about God. So that language is always partial, it's always limited. So of course we can call God mother. Perhaps that's just as adequate or maybe just as inadequate as calling God father, perhaps. We might also say that there are good grounds for talking about God as mother, because actually God is mystery. So there's this staple teaching within Christianity which says that God is incomprehensible, God is ineffable, God is beyond our words, God is beyond our human speech, and beyond our human classifications, gender being one such human classification. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 18 says, what likeness will you find for God, and what form to resemble his? In other words, how can you possibly compare this ineffable, incomprehensible God to anything? God is beyond all that we know. And if God is beyond all that we know, then again we might say, of course, we can call God mother, because that's just as inadequate as calling God father, for example. We might also go one step further perhaps and say, well, God, according to Christian tradition, can be seen as being irreducible to one gender or being even beyond gender. Genesis 1:27 says, so God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And according to queer theologian Chris Greenough, this suggests that God must be at least bi-gendered, by which he means God must not be reducible to one gender. If the image of God is male and female, then there is little grounds for obsessing and fixating on male language to speak about God. Galatians 3:28, here we see Paul saying that there is no longer Jew or Greek, no longer slave or free, no longer male and female, for all are one in Christ Jesus. Here Paul seems to be reminding the community in Galatia that actually identity in Jesus Christ is somehow transcending of gender, certainly of a binary view of gender. There's no longer male and female when one's identity is found in Jesus Christ. Can we call God mother? Another response might be, well, of course we can, because our God talk is metaphorical. And if those of you gathered today on this call know anything about Sallie McFague, one of the things that you may know is that she wants to remind us that God talk is metaphorical. It has within it, she tells us, both an is and an is not component. That means that when we say God is Father, we're actually saying God is Father, but much more God is not Father. When we say God is mother, therefore, we're saying, yes, God is mother, but actually more than that, God is not mother. And when we're saying that God is mother or God is father, the is not is just as important as the is. And what that means is that all language that we use to speak about God has its kind of sell-by date and has limitations as well. It can never tell us everything about God. It may be illuminating, and for Sallie McFague it certainly is, but it can never tell us everything about God. Finally, we may say, can we call God mother? We may say, well, of course we can, because there's a theological precedent for it. We might draw on passages from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, like Isaiah 66 and Numbers 11, which seems to show us Yahweh actually modelling himself after a mother and suggesting that he can be seen as being like a mother. Luke 13:34 in the New Testament shows us that Jesus images himself as mother. Jesus images himself as a mother hen kind of brooding over his young in this particular passage. Mother imagery for God and for Jesus has theological grounds, biblical grounds in this instance, but more than being biblical, maybe it has wider theological purchase. Julian of Norwich, who's a medieval mystic theologian, writes this really brilliant kind of book called Revelations of Divine Love, where she's telling us about all the kind of religious experiences that she is having and she has had of God. And one of those experiences is of Christ as mother and God as mother. So she uses this imagery of God as mother quite considerably in some of her work. In Revelations of Divine Love, she says, as truly as God is our Father, so just as truly is he our mother. In other words, God is just as much Father as God is mother. Interesting that she places God as he alongside the imagery of mother. He is our mother. And, a queer reading of that, if you like, is to suggest that she's blending gender in a really kind of quite novel and very interesting kind of way. Certainly beyond, it would seem, a binary way of thinking about gender. And there are other depictions of God as female, we might say, in the Bible anyway. God as midwife in the Psalms, God as wisdom in some of the wisdom literature, like the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Interestingly, the reference to God as Sophia or wisdom in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible is a female personification of God. This is a she figure who meets us in the tradition of Sophia. And many feminist theologians have kind of looked at that in a little bit more detail. So we may say, of course, there's good grounds for thinking about God as mother. Our language is limited, it's partial, God is mystery, God is ineffable. The good theological precedent for speaking about God as mother doesn't seem particularly controversial, perhaps. And yet there's always been a backlash to speaking about God as mother or in ways which draw on female imagery or female terminology. When feminist theologians first started debating this in the 80s and 90s, trying to kind of remind the church that actually its fixatedness on male language for God is deeply harmful for women, because it suggests that women somehow aren't in the image of God, that needs to be changed. There was a conservative backlash at that point, where conservative Christian theologians came out and said that if you are to change the terminology that we use of God from, say, for example, father to mother, then what you're actually doing is changing the God that we worship. Actually, you're not speaking about the Christian God anymore, you're speaking about another God. And that might seem maybe a bit far-fetched if you're listening today, but actually more recently the Church of England, as pictured on the screen here, in 2023 came out and said that it was actually re-evaluating its use of gendered language to speak about God. The Faith and Order Commission of the Church in England committed to examine whether to use gender neutral terms to speak about God, certainly committed to evaluating its possibly its overuse of male pronouns to speak about God, and asking questions about how relevant and how appropriate, I suppose, that was today. And a conservative backlash to that as well, as kind of shown, I suppose, by this comment by the Reverend Dr. Ian Paul, who is Associate Minister at St. Nick's in Nottingham, who said, is reported as saying, I should say, according to this particular article in The Guardian, the fact, so this is the Reverend Dr. Ian Paul saying, the fact that God is called Father cannot be substituted by Mother without changing meaning, nor can it be gender neutralised to parent without loss of meaning. In other words, you cannot switch father to mother, and you cannot switch father to parent. Father language is important, and to switch the language is almost to switch the God. It changes the meaning at the very least. Father, according to Ian Paul, means something very different to parent and mother. But as a second step, even more than that, he seems to be suggesting that father belongs to God, or at least is more fitting for God than mother and parent. That to speak about God or to call God mother or parent is actually not appropriate, whereas to speak about God as father is right and appropriate. So what does Sallie McFague say? So if you've come across Sallie McFague before, you'll know that she is, or was, because she's no longer with us now, unfortunately. She died in 2019, so just be aware of that. But Sallie McFague was a really important feminist theologian, one of the most important, I would say, Christian theologians of the 20th century. She made a considerable contribution to feminist theology, that kind of theology which is concerned with advocating for women and for women's humanity, but also a significant contribution to eco-theology, that kind of theology which is concerned with trying to respond to planetary degradation and planetary destruction and the threats and harm to the environment. And she deals with this question of Christian God talk and how should we be speaking about God. And she's really worried about the way in which the Christian tradition has fixated on male language, because that seems to rubber stamp sexism. It seems to suggest that sexism is okay, but also she's worried because she thinks that we're in a time where we're facing ecological destruction, and we need to talk about God in responsible ways that don't encourage human beings to take liberties with the planet and to misuse its resources. And in response to this question, can we talk about God as mother? She absolutely wants to say yes. And she wants to say that it's more responsible, both in terms of the challenge of sexism and the challenge of planetary destruction and devastation, to talk about God as mother. So how does she get there? Well, a starting point is to say that God talk is metaphorical. She says, as metaphor, that means that the language that we use to talk about God belongs in one context, and we're using that language to speak about something which is completely foreign to that context. Let me give you an example. So she says that when we talk about God as Father, we're drawing our language from a human context and from a human experience of either being a father or being fathered. And we're applying that to a completely different foreign context, i.e. the context of deity, of divinity, of God, who is obviously not a father and is not human. You're taking language from one context and applying it to something which is completely outside of that context. The problem, though, she says, is that the Christian tradition has tended to forget that its language that it uses for God is metaphorical. More particularly, it has tended to suggest that talk about God as Father is a description of who God really is, when in fact talk about God as Father, according to Sallie McFague, just offers us a picture of who God is, something which is taken from human context and our imagination to speak about God, to capture something about God, but it's certainly not a description of who God is in God's self. The language we use about God as metaphor is a human construction, as it says here on the screen. It's mostly fiction, she goes on to say. It's an elaboration. So it's obviously limited and it's partial. She's particularly concerned about father language within the Christian tradition because she says that this type of language has swamped Christian God talk, pushing out other metaphors, other ways of speaking about God, like God as mother. When there is a theological precedent for speaking about God in other ways, that those ways have been pushed out because father language has demanded and commanded all of the space, and she's worried about that. The metaphor of father, she argues, in models of God, has received massive attention in our tradition, pushing out, therefore, other metaphors. And she's worried about the way father language legitimizes, justifies, supports patriarchy. Patriarchy is this kind of idea that society is often structured in ways that support male rule and male superiority, systems of organisation or relationship where men are more important than women, where men rule and women are ruled. And she thinks that Christian God talk, where father language kind of takes precedent, actually supports patriarchy, male superiority. Why? We'll get on to look at why this might be the case in a second. But she does say on the back of that if we use male pronouns exclusively to speak about God, then what we're doing is we're suggesting by doing that God can be captured, that God can be known, that we can use human speech to speak about God in an authoritative kind of way. And all of those things, she says, has us fall into the trap of idolatry, worshipping an idol, not actually God, because our speech kind of gives the impression that it is God, that it can capture the essence of God's identity. When in fact that is not the case. God, she says, is she and he and neither. And she's worried about the way the metaphor has been sidelined, as I've said. Interestingly, she does remind us that if we do take that Genesis passage that we read together at the start of this webinar seriously, where God says that God is made in the image of male and female equally, then that means that male and female imagery, according to Sallie McFague, ought to be used to speak about God, that we should be using male and female metaphors in our imaging of God, and not just limiting ourselves to exclusively male speech. So you can expect her to say that we need to diversify our language. We need to be more imaginative with the way that we speak and image God. Her intention, it is important to flag here, is not to replace father language. She understands it's part of the Christian tradition. It's very well established and it's a well-worn metaphor, but we really do need to have it and hold it in its rightful place as just one picture among many. It shouldn't just be seen as the only way to image God or one of the better ways to image God. There are lots of other ways and we need to experiment. So let's experiment. And, you know, one of the main ways in which she wants to experiment is by thinking about God as mother. But before I just kind of end with what she says about God as mother, it's important to understand what she says about the problem with Christian God talk. And I know I've already kind of painted a little picture of what might be wrong with it, but she gives a more detailed picture, and it's kind of important to get behind some of the detail. So she definitely wants to suggest that at the heart of the issue around Christian God talk is the fact that Western Christianity has wedded itself to what she calls a monarchical model. This monarchical model kind of images God as an absolute monarch, as an absolute king who demands absolute obedience from his subjects. And this monarchical model, she tells us, is kind of propped up by a range of other metaphors which feed into it. And these other metaphors that prop it up and give it life, if you like veins, if you like, going into the circulatory system of the monarchical model, are the metaphors of God as King, God as Father, God as Almighty, and God as Lord. We're familiar, perhaps some of us, with the way in which the Christian tradition is referred to God as King, God as Father, God as Almighty, and God as Lord. The monarchical model, according to Sallie McFague, ultimately images God like the fella which is on the screen here. This God is a monarch, a king. This God sits and lives outside of the world. This God is distant and disconnected from the world, or at least at a distance from the world. This God rules over the world and demands obedience from his subjects. And this God is a he God. This God is male. So she says, look, there are certain features of this monarchical model, and she finds them all quite problematic. The first one is that this monarchical model does suggest that God is he, that God is male, that this God actually likes his pronouns, and he is definitely a he, him. This God is in absolute control of the universe. And McFague is worried that this kind of male-centered monarchical model gives divine credence to patriarchy. Here we have a male who is in charge of everything, who demands obedience from his subjects, who is disconnected and aloof. And this, according to Sallie McFague, just provides the perfect support for patriarchy, for men being in charge, because this male God is in charge of everything. Another feature of the monarchical model is that it's triumphalist. In this model, God defeats God's enemies. God rules over all that God makes and triumphs over all his adversaries. And she's worried about that particular feature of the monarchical model, because if God is this kind of all-powerful triumphalist kind of enemy defeating kind of God, then there's really nothing for us to do in this life. God will do everything for us. So if things go wrong or things get difficult, we just need to kind of call upon God, and God will swoop down from the sky and make everything okay. It kind of encourages passivity. It encourages us to be passive towards the world. And you can expect her to be concerned about this, to be passive towards the environment and taking care of the planet. Another feature of the monarchical model is that this God is distant. This God is kind of removed from the world. Just like the image on the screen, actually, God is here, it's pictured as being on top of the world, outside of the world. And the monarchical model for Sallie McFague does that. It images God as outside the world. God doesn't belong, according to the monarchical model, in the world. God lives outside of it. God's abode is outside of it. God's kingdom is not of this world. When we die, actually, we join God in God's kingdom, which is elsewhere. And she's worried again that actually, this idea that God is distant, this idea that actually we as human beings, if we are saved, leave this planet to join God outside of the world. It kind of encourages us, even as human beings, to not really care too much about the world, because we don't belong here either. God exists outside of it. In the end, we're going to where God is, outside of it. So do we really need to care too much for the world? Maybe not. Finally, she suggests that another feature of this monarchical model is that God controls the world through domination. All power is on God's side. According to this model, God is all powerful. And for Sallie McFague, if God has all the power, she says in Models of God, if God has all the power, we have none. So it again kind of pacifies human beings and suggests that we don't really have a role to play. So what does she say in response? Well, if you remember, she does want to suggest that our language about God is metaphorical, it's limited, it's partial, it's not descriptive of who God is in God's self, it's a picture, it's pictorial, and therefore gives us a particular kind of knowledge. So she kind of like says, let's just experiment with a different way of speaking about God. Let's test how far the model of God as mother can be put to work. Let's test how far it can go. And she knows it's limited because it's a metaphor, just like God as Father is a metaphor. So she's absolutely fine for us to come back to her and say, yeah, but there's a few kind of problems with talking about God in this way. She'd say, yeah, there is, but same for every single way of speaking about God. So let's just be brave and let's go with it. God as mother. And she wants to present this to us because she says, look, in the face of the monarchical model, where there are so many difficulties with that dominant, well-worn, well-established model, we need a way of naming God, which is going to be responsive to sexism and misogyny, which she's worried about as a feminist theologian, and also that's going to respond to the fact that human beings are destroying the planet. So we need a model which is more appropriate for our time, she says, and for our contemporary situation. She reminds us that we're living in an ecological age where we're more aware of the way in which we are interdependent with the planet and with other species. She says our time is characterised by a growing concern for the well-being of all life and by the need for an ecological perspective that recognises human dependence on our environment. Unless we learn to accept this, we may well not survive. So it's really important that we really do accept this dependency on the environment for our own survival. So we need models of God, ways of metaphorically imaging and speaking about God that are going to remind us of this dependency. The monarchical model just suggests that we can be distant, just like God is distant. God is outside of the world. We're obviously, eventually going to meet God in this kind of abode outside of the planet, outside of the world, sorry. So it doesn't really, it gives us this kind of like, I don't know, this kind of legitimacy in being detached, and she's worried about that detachment. So what does she say about God as mother? Well, one of the important things to note about this image is that it's part of another model that she wants to develop in relation to God, the Christian God. So we know that she wants to kind of poo-poo the idea of the monarchical model of God because she doesn't see that as being very helpful and quite dangerous. So she wants to pivot to another model of understanding God, and that model of understanding God is the world as God's body, the world as God's body. Here she is suggesting that the world can be seen as God's body. And this is quite radical, certainly in the kind of 80s when she's presenting this idea or this metaphor. What she means by the world as God's body is that everything that exists in the world is part of God, is part of God's body. So that means that to harm the planet to harm the world actually is to harm God. It means, therefore, that our actions towards the planet, towards the environment, but also towards one another, has serious theological and ethical significance. Not to relate justly and ethically to the world or to each other harms God. She goes as far as to call it sin. As God's body, the world, according to McFague, is depicted as an organic, complex web of life in which we all live. It's a web of life in which we all live and move and have our being. And this is very different to the dominant Western tradition, she tells us, where God creates out of nothing through his words or his hands. God is not like an artist, she tells us, who kind of like paints something with their hands and then steps back from that creation and can be distant from it and turn away from it and never see it again. God is not like that. God is an interested God. And the way in which she kind of develops one side of that metaphor of the world as God's body is to develop the metaphor of God as mother. When she talks about God as mother, what she's doing is giving a more personal dimension to the world as God's body model. Now, this takes on a more personal note. God is not just any body, God is mother. And this metaphor, she tells us, is especially important because it values women's physicality. It values their birthing capacity. And this is quite radical as well, because historically, for thousands of years, women's bodies within the Christian tradition have been despised, especially for their birthing capacities. That this has been seen as associated with women's changeableness and with menstruation and with blood and with all of those kinds of horrible things, which I say horrible things, the Christian tradition has often seen them as horrible, is linked with Eve and with sin and corruption and with change and with age and with all those things that the Christian tradition has struggled to process, mainly, one might say, because they have been associated with women's bodies. So God as mother gives a personal kind of note to the world as God's body kind of model. According to this way of speaking about God, God as mother is creator. God is the giver of life. God gives birth to the world. And that means that God's relationship to the world isn't this monarchical model kind of relationship where God is distant and aloof in an armchair above the planet. God actually as mother is close to God's creation. God feels God's creation. God intimately and immediately knows it like a mother knows her child. In her we live, we move, we have our being. This God is close to the world, not distant, not removed, not separated. In this model, the world isn't distant. But also in this model, God's love isn't impartial. It's actually interested. God cares for all species, for all life equally. God doesn't kind of favour one particular species over another or one particular gender over another. God's love is impartial and interested. And this type of love, Sallie McFague says, has always been spoken about in the Christian tradition as agape, as a giving kind of love that is not reliant on any kind of anything in return. God cares in this particular imaging of God. God cares about the basic needs of all life and desires the survival of everything that is. The final thing that she kind of notes about this particular image of God as mother is that here God is presented or imaged as just and as judge. And as judge, God can be imaged as angry, as quite defensive of God's young, as protective. And these, she reminds us, are characteristics which the Christian tradition has often spoken about as in kind of masculine ways. God is a he God who gets angry and who is defensive and who is a protector. But she says, no, God as mother is, an angry God who actually absolutely despises the unfair and unequal distribution of power, where the basic necessities needed for the continuation of life are challenged. This kind of God gets angry about those injustices and about those inequalities. This is a God of justice and a God who is judge. And God as mother therefore condemns any person who refuses to share what is needed for the continuation of life, for the survival of life. This God as mother, calls us all to follow this God in caring for the world, in providing the environment where life can be sustained, where all life can survive. She says we must become the gardeners and the caretakers of our Eden, our beautiful garden, not taming and ruling it, let alone despoiling and desecrating it, as we often do, but being to it as a universal parent, willing the existence of all species, and as a good householder, ordering the just distribution of the necessities of existence. Interestingly, in that quotation, she does suggest that we all have within us, all human beings have this kind of parental, nurturing kind of sensibility. We are all universal parents, whether we have children or not. So there are questions to ask about whether she's right there, I suppose. So let me just end by maybe just evaluating some of the strengths and weaknesses with her model. So God as mother, can we speak about God as mother? Sallie McFague says yes. What are the kind of strengths with that? Well, on the one hand, she certainly wants to avoid gender stereotyping. We've already seen her say, if God is mother, then God as mother orders the universe, is just, is angry, and is loving and protecting. And here we have a kind of mixing up of masculine and feminine stereotypes, really. So she's trying to challenge the way in which the Christian tradition has often linked certain things with masculinity and certain things with femininity. Here, God as mother has the full shebang. She's angry and she's loving at the same time. We might also say that, McFague's contribution here is good because she's not just concerned with tackling sexism, she's actually trying to develop a model which is going to stand the test of time, which is there within the theological tradition, already has a precedent, but actually doesn't just tackle sexism, but also tackles ecological degradation, the threat that the planet is under, and we're all too aware of that ongoing threat. And therefore it's a really important contribution, we might say. So it's important as well, we might say, because she allocates value to women's bodies. She says that God has a body, that God is body, the world as God's body. And that's quite radical because it suggests that bodies aren't this dirty, terrible kind of, I don't know, albatross kind of thing, that bodies are actually divine and can help us have an encounter with God. Bodies are good. So she's great for celebrating bodies. She's also maybe to be commended for the way that she values the physical work of birthing. Here, God as mother obviously is involved with birthing and sustaining life, not just birthing life, but also sustaining life. And as we've already mentioned, birthing and that physical kind of work of birthing and pregnancy and kind of going on and parenting and sustaining life has not always been looked upon with the kind of value that perhaps it should have. And finally, obviously, her work in this particular model is attentive to environmental threats and the environmental crisis, which we might want to commend her for, obviously. But there are difficulties with it. So we might want to challenge her on whether the monarchical model of God is actually adequate. Perhaps we want to say, excuse me, that the monarchical model, excuse me, I have to have a drink. Perhaps we want to say that, she's wrong, but the monarchical model actually isn't really Christian, that it's more kind of God of philosophy kind of idea rather than the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible isn't this monarchical dictator, despot kind of figure. We might also want to get her on the way that she's connecting the motif of God as mother to her use of female pronouns. So this is a she god, a she, her god, who is mother. Does this suggest, I'm just thinking about the Supreme Court ruling, really, does this suggest that one can only be a woman if one has the capacity, biological capacity to give birth? And there is something perhaps a little bit uncomfortable about Sallie McFague's metaphor, which seems to suggest that those things go side by side. She's also working with quite a binary view of gender. So in Models of God, she does say, since all agents, all humans are either male or female, either pronoun can be used or should be used. But now we might want to say, hey, Sallie, you know, it's not really the case that all human beings are either male or female. We might want to kind of just want her to just think again about that statement. The final 2 points here on the screen, we have Daphne Hampson saying, look, you know, the church has talked about God as Father for 2,000 years. If you change it, then Christianity might look unrecognisable. And then my point, right at the bottom of the screen there, which is taken from another book that I wrote on the Trinity, where I basically say, look, we can speak about God as mother, but that is not necessarily going to stop us from thinking about God in ways which picture him as tyrannical and distant and aloof. In fact, we might use the language of God as mother, but think about God in oppositional ways to that. So lots to be thinking about. I've probably gone on for far too long. If you have enjoyed this particular webinar, then do check out our pages on the internet, on the website there, and you know, message me if you would like, email or Twitter, etc. Thanks, Leah.
Thanks, Hannah. That was really interesting. I'm busy writing things down here. Has anyone got any questions? Please just pop them on and we can have a look at them. I'll just give you a couple of minutes because I certainly know that my brain is still processing these ideas. I know I read a little while ago about how a lot of the patriarchal views came through when people in sort of the Roman, because they were very male focused, and they made it what they wanted it. And if you take it back beyond that to the nature-based, you know, there's so much there, isn't there, that you can, and like you say, those kind of parenting things start to exclude a whole group of people. And it was interesting. I hadn't realised that there'd been a discussion around the neutrality, the term neutral terms, because it's very quick. People are very quick to change, for example, song or hymn lyrics from men to people.
Yeah.
But obviously not so quick to change something else because there's so many challenges. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there's quite a lot to unpick in such short time. I'm sure we could go on for quite a long time, and I'm sure, you know, these are the kind of things that can be challenged within our courses, the modules we can take. So if anyone on the call is interested, please do have a look. I haven't got any other questions coming in. So looking at the time, I think, you know, we'll leave it at that. If anyone does have anything, you've got my email. I'm sure that, you know, we can address it outside, so to speak, because if something pops up, I'm sure Hannah will be willing if I pop over any thoughts or ideas you want to raise or want any resources. Just for those of you who are, sorry, absolutely.
Yeah, I was going to say absolutely, And you can email me as well if you've got questions. Yes. Email me directly or whatever.
Yeah, get in touch with Hannah directly. And for those of you studying A-level equivalent, you know, if you can just fill in our post questionnaire, that would be really helpful. I am also going to send a more general feedback form at a later date. I think Hannah's just popped her email in the chat as well, h.bacon@chester.ac.uk. So that's it for this one. Next week, we have our second instalment with Richard, who will be talking. He's a lecturer in contemporary Islam, and he's going to be exploring Islamic teachings on crime and punishment in contemporary Britain. And I think that's really, really relevant in some, much like the gender talk that we've just had in today's society. But for now, we're going to say thank you to Hannah and thank you to the audience, and hopefully we shall see you again next week. Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.